Good afternoon and welcome to the second session of this year's Agricultural Symposium. I'm Allison Felix and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor in the Research Department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. As you know, this year's Agricultural Symposium is focused on productivity growth in agriculture, and during this session, we will explore how technology and the use of data will affect future prospects for agricultural productivity. We are pleased to have with us today several experts to shed some light on this topic. Similar to the first session, the session format will include a speaker, followed by a discussant and two panelists. There will be time for questions at the end of the session, so please submit them at any time using the questions comments link on the player page. But before we get started with our first speaker, we'd like to get your perspectives. Please take a moment to respond to the following question. What do you consider the biggest risk to productivity growth in agriculture over the next 10 years? Macroeconomic or financial market risk, B, farm income, profitability, ag prices, etc., C, labor shortages, D, environmental risk, E, policy developments or geopolitical risk, or F, other. After the poll closes, we invite you to share any comments related to your responses using the questions comments link. As a reminder, Nate Kaufman will share the results of our session polls during the closing discussion tomorrow. Also, please note that all of the session's materials, including the upcoming PowerPoint presentation and the associated paper, are available on our website. You can access the website using the link on the player page. Now, to start the discussion, our first speaker for this session is Terry Griffin. Terry Griffin is an associate professor and cropping systems economist in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Kansas State University. He specializes in farm management and agricultural technology. In addition to giving presentations across North America, Terry has also delivered invited presentations across Africa, Australia, and Europe. I'll turn it over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Allison. I appreciate that. And I appreciate Nate Kaufman for inviting me. And it's been an honor to be here with this panel and the previous panel I've really enjoyed. I'm going to speak about the role of technology and data. And interestingly enough, I'm going to build upon some of the comments that was presented earlier. Phil Party talked about human capital. Larkin Martin talked about differences between small and big data. And that's sort of where I'm going to leave today is talking about big data. My co-authors are Elizabeth Yeager here at Kansas State University and Lavana Trawick at Arkansas Colleges of Health Education. Lavana is not an economist, which makes her a very valuable part of this team. She's a gerontologist by training, and so she's bringing in some things that I don't think about, the aging process and how different people of different ages use technology differently. And I hope you will find her contribution as interesting as I have. I'm going to the second slide. This is a table, and this is largely provided by Lavana on generational characteristics. I'm going to kind of focus on the road that begins with technology. The silent generation, as a review, were born before the end of World War II. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964, immediately after World War II. Gen X was after that, 1965 to 1980. Millennials, who, by the way, are not children, they were born between 1981 and 1996. And teenagers and college-age students are Generation Z, born since 1997 and probably up to 2012. Lavana would remind us that each of these generations use technology differently. The silent generation prefers snail mail over email and Facebook. They're largely disengaged with technology, and in her words, they hope to outlive it. Baby boomers, they've sort of mastered technology. They were the early technology adopters. In the social media realm, they prefer Facebook over the other platforms. Gen X, they're digital immigrants. They adopted email as adults. They enjoy it. Today, they regard email and Twitter as their electronic media. They view email as a form of communication. Millennials, Instagram is a social media platform that they enjoy. They're digital natives. They employ it. They may not remember a time without the internet. Gen Z were born in the world with the internet. They're technologic. They cannot live without it. Snapchat and so forth are the platforms that they utilize. It is my hypothesis as a economist that those groups who were born in the world with the internet will be distinctly different than those who adopted it as adults. And this is something I want to present some research and challenge our participants to think about. One other thing that I would want to bring up about this group is that millennials and Gen Z, when we talk about working on the farm, working in the private sector in town, millennials and Generation Z tend to use phrases like work with rather than work for. And so this has been one of the things that we've noticed even within the farm operation of having a younger and an older generation at work on a farm is the simple terminology between the two and the ideology that goes along with that. Going to the next slide is part of this data we see a lot. The lower line is the median age of all farmers as reported by USDA Census of Agriculture. Along the x-axis is the dates and y-axis is ages. The dotted green line towards the top is the life expectancy for all Americans at birth. It's increasing about the same rate as the increase in median farm age. The purple line is one that we added to this publicly available data. This is from Kansas. This is the Kansas Farm Management Association, KFMA. This is the 98th percentile eldest farm operator in the data set of 2,000 plus farm operations today. This data set goes back to 1973 electronically. The 98th percentile oldest farmers in Kansas surpassed the age of life expectancy in the late 1980s and is increasing at an increasing rate compared to life expectancy of all Americans. And we're going to come back to this. A few things that we want to keep in mind here is one, the previous panel talked about labor being available and human capital issues. Larkin Martin from Alabama had discussed this somewhat. Elderly farmers tend to need adaptations and automation in order to operate equipment additional years once they begin to have neck and shoulder problems. And so this is one of the things about the quality of life that my co-author LaVonna Trewick would bring into the discussion is that sometimes utility maximization is as important as profit maximizations for some farm operators. And then also the age group may have some planning horizons that may be too short with respect to farm data to really put it into utilization, especially for sole proprietor farms. Going to the next slide, slide number 4. This is some data from Kansas Farm Management Association as well. Lots of things we could talk about. We could spend all day on this graph, but we won't. The most commonly adopted technologies in Kansas for sure, but probably everywhere else in the developed world has automated in its name, automated guidance, automated section control. And this is by no means a coincidence. When we can remove the human skill requirements, i.e. reduce the human capital necessary to make equipment, make technology work, then it becomes more readily adopted. Technologies such as variable rate and sensor technologies such as soil sampling and yield monitor data do not reduce the human capital requirements, but increase the requirements to make use of data. And not all farmers have that human capital that they're willing to devote to make data technologies work. So we're seeing not ubiquitous adoption yet. We're also seeing some leveling off since 2014, most likely due to delayed equipment purchases from low commodity prices, but we're still evaluating that phenomenon as well. It's been said, Gregory, who's going to speak also this panel, asked me about technology utilization as a system. Well, that is definitely the case. Although automated guidance today seems to be the entry point, that hasn't always been the case. It was actually commercialized in the late 1990s. Most common system on a farm in Kansas is to have three, not necessarily any particular three, but three technologies of this list of 8. The second most common combination of technologies in Kansas is actually 0. Having none of these technologies is the second most common combination, followed by 5 technologies and 4 technologies, and then 1 technology. Very few farms have all 8 technologies on their farm. There has been some disadoption. We assume that rate is about 5%. There are some good examples of going from a light bar to a automated guidance, and that's not necessarily disadoption, but an upgrade. And we did note that if farmers adopted variable rate too early in the process, that tended to lead to disadoption of technology altogether. In this next slide, slide number 5, let's discuss the timeline of when things were commercialized. And I wanted to mention something real quick that Larkin Martin said that resonated with me. She mentioned open source data, open source software in agriculture. This particular timeline I built with open source software. It's on the agmanager.info website, the Precision Ag timeline, and it's an interactive, fun way of looking at when technologies were commercialized. And looking at this, the couple of interesting things is, the newest thing on this list is 15 years old now. So these technologies are by no means new. Automated guidance was commercialized about 1999, year 2000. Well, think of it this way. The secondary graph at the bottom, that is the age of a young baby boomer or an older Generation X member at that time. Light bars were commercialized when some baby boomers were still in their 20s. I just want to put that into perspective. The next slide, slide number 6, kind of summarizes the farm operations in Kansas across time. The y-axis is the proportion of farm operations that are ran by each of the generations. The top line at the very top with the dashed orange line is the baby boomers. Today, about half of the farms in Kansas are operated by a baby boomer. And I want to note that in a paper, we had baby boomers and silent generation flipped accidentally, so I would admit to the mistake. Silent generation, the very oldest generation that we have information for, is the solid green line. Today, it's slightly less than 20% of all farms in Kansas are operated by a silent generation member. The next generation, Gen X, is dashed purple. It's also slightly above 20%, about the same proportion as silent generation. The fastest growing group in Kansas operating farms are the millennials. They're 25-ish, mid-20s to early 40s years old. They're the fastest growing farm operators in Kansas. Today, they're almost 15% of total farm operations. We have a couple of Gen Zs as well in Kansas in our data set. Next slide, slide 7, is about sole proprietor farms. I mentioned this earlier. So we looked at which of these generations had what technologies, and then we started asking questions about profitability and productivity. And it was a little striking at first when I saw this, in that the silent generation, the oldest generation, had a very similar distribution as the youngest generation, the millennial generation. And the baby boomer and the Gen X were very similar as well. So we started hypothesizing about this, and we knew that millennials wanted technology and the silent generation was less excited about it, just by the general notion of generations. But then we thought, well, maybe millennials have limited resources. So we took the same graph, but instead of sole proprietor farms with one decision maker, we looked at multiple operator farms in slide number 8. We went to the next slide for multiple operator farms. Here we can see that all the generations across had increased adoption of these technologies, and in particular, automated guidance. And one of the things that we know about automated guidance is that it essentially has less requirement for skill, less human capital requirements to make it work, as opposed to yield monitors and variable rate that actually increase requirements to work from the farm operator or labor on the farm or even third-party consultants. So farm data, when you have multiple generations at play, can be a proxy for the intimate knowledge that's lost from not being on every single acre. So for instance, if you have 2 farm operators, it's essentially impossible for both of them to be on the combine or cotton picker harvester on every single acre of that farm. Data can act as a proxy, yield maps and summary statistics can act as a proxy for the intimate knowledge. Here, think about the human capital. If a farmer does not want to allocate human capital effort into making data technologies work, they may find that they should be marketing grain, trying to buy inputs, some other task that may have a higher return to them. Then the farm data is one that gets ignored sometimes. It takes a lot of effort, not only by the farm operator, but the third-party consultants and the platforms that are used to collect data and analyze that data, which is the next slide, and slide number 9. So I get a lot of questions about farm data, big data, small data. And so this graph is, I intentionally drew it not to scale because I don't know when things are going to happen. If you look at the x-axis on time, I'm really vague. The y-axis has some numbers on it, but they're sort of made up numbers. The data platforms, and these are some of the companies that Larkin Martin had referred to earlier that are vying to attract farm data from growers, farm fields, acres. The green line has a y-axis on the right, and this is the proportion of growers, farm fields, acres that have contributed data into the system so far. This is the way I view it. Today, there are lots of different platforms, multinational companies, startups, Silicon Valley, companies starting up in the heartland here in Kansas and Iowa, Missouri, maybe even out of the country. Lots of platforms are trying to get farm data, and farmers are kind of skeptical. They're hesitant. They don't know which ones to join. And the way I look at this is that it's sort of like the social media we were talking about earlier. It's in economic terms as a network externality. The value of the service is a function of the number of other users of the service. So if I'm the only farmer that joins a farm data company, you can't really do cohort analysis with one farm. I could just stay home and keep on the data from my farm on a laptop and be the same thing. When there's more acres and data into that system, it has value to the other people, other farmers to join. That's the network externality. That's the one there's a winner-take-all business model for data platforms. It's also, to me, a natural monopoly. As a farmer, I don't want to have to connect to multiple permissions in order to retrieve information I'm looking for. There's a huge inefficiencies at play. So this, we could spend, again, all day on this. I have a whole presentation based around this graph that leads up to why, the telephone systems were a good example of a network externality and so forth. Sometime in the future, I expect the number of data platforms to substantially decrease such that the farmer would have a better chance of choosing a successful data platform. So, summing up, we've talked about several different things on productivity. It's been said that the profitability of site-specific agriculture is indeed site-specific. It matters where, what field, when, what year. 2012 was very different than 2021 with rainfall and so forth. The what is very important here too. It's the technology, whether it's a CPC, crop protection chemical, a variable rate machinery, or an algorithm that goes into it, the automated guidance. It's the product, the what. The one that we often forget about, even economists when we're doing analyses, we forget about the who, the person. All right, so the human capital is paramount. I will argue that when people ask me, is variable rate technology profitable? And I answer, well, sure, sometimes, some places, and for some people. It depends quite a bit on if that particular farm operator has the human capital that they're willing to devote. Not that they don't have it, they may rather put it towards some other competing use. Or it could be at arm's length with a service provider. But the who is very important here. And sometimes when all these pieces don't fall into place, waiting may be the optimal decision. It goes back to basic economics, the benefit cost ratio. As humans, we can define the cost of doing something a whole lot easier than we can the benefits. So I always challenge the farm operators I work with to ask them, will the benefits of your decision outweigh your cost? And here, it may be perceived benefits or it may be perceived cost. And sometimes the cost may be in the relinquishing of farm data. Once it's relinquished, this concept of excludability has been diminished, and any chances of ownership are sort of negated at that point. Generation Z will be operating farms entirely different than baby boomers. My co-author, Lavonna Trewick, has said that baby boomers expect technology to be as easy as 1, 2, 3. Gen X and millennials expect technology to be as easy as 1. If it doesn't work correctly the first time, they won't be patient with it. They're going to move on because they expect things to be immediate and working right the first time. She also challenged me to think about generational skipping. And in agriculture, this may be something slightly unfamiliar, but think about farm operators who are 60, 70 years old who are just now getting reins to the operation from family members, and their high school classmates are retired. So again, I am Terry Griffin, and here's the contact information for my co-authors, Elizabeth Yeager and Lavonna Trewick.
Thank you, Carrie, for sharing your thoughts on the role of technology and data. Our discussant for this section is Gregory Graff. Gregory Graff is a professor of the Economics of Innovation and Entrepreneurship in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Colorado State University. His work looks at the economics and public policy of technological innovation and entrepreneurship in the agricultural and food industries, both regionally and globally. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Gregory.
Well, thank you very much, Allison. And thank you to Nate and the whole team there at the Kansas City Fed for organizing this really interesting symposium this year. And thank you, Terry, for a very interesting introduction to the adoption dynamics going on in precision agriculture. This is a really helpful discussion. The objective here of looking at how generational demographics have driven or at least been associated with the adoption of precision technologies, I think, opens up a couple of very important complexities around the technological future for this, and thus the potentials for productivity gains to be coming from the big data revolution as we move forward. The spirit of the discussion here follows very much in the tradition of agricultural adoption modeling, which goes back easily a century, looking at adoption of improved varieties of crops, as well as early adoption of agricultural machinery. Those kinds of models are necessarily driven by the economic fundamentals. Does the technology drive profitability on the operation? It is an economic decision after all. And so at the core of these models, of course, is the profit function. And you need to show expected profitability in order to say, yes, I'm going to invest. But there are always important conditioning variables, things that will influence that decision, push it forward, push it back, make it more likely, make it less likely. Institutional characteristics, finance, access to credit, questions of that nature are always included, but also these operator characteristics. I think some of the very earliest models would include an age variable in terms of the operator making the decision to adopt. But this paper does a really nice job at taking that stretch of age and breaking it down into the different generations, and then trying to bring to us from maybe some of the IT marketing literature, just what are the broad brushstroke characteristics, as Terry reviewed here, of the different generations to technology, and how are they going to view it? How are they going to use it? How are they going to relate to it? And how might that be driving their decisions? Now, one area that I struggle with a little bit is really the, no farm is as simple as some of these statistics typically tend to make it. Even the single operator farms almost always have other people involved on the team doing the management. Your senior most individual may be ultimately making the final call on or waste, in their point of view, time on trying to figure out how to make some complicated data work for the operation. The team matters, and who they have available, who they have around them matters. And whether or not that's always reflected in the data that we're looking at is kind of hard to know. There's also obviously the complexity on the technology side here. What's being adopted? The paper really nicely lays them out as discrete choices. The auto guidance or the grid soil sampling. But as we all fully understand, there is in fact a lot of interoperability or not between these different technologies and the systems, and the potential complementarities between the different individual technologies may end up with interesting interactions. It's an area I think that can be further explored here as we go forward. I'm sure that the big companies that are trying to market this stuff are aware that if a farmer already has X installed, their probability of adopting Y is, therefore, much higher potentially, or maybe it's irrelevant. This brings me to at least comment on the internal small data versus external big data aspects of adoption, and thus the potential increases in productivity that can be driven here. Because the small data, the internal operation-specific improvements in productivity sound like they are already getting exploited, maybe on the majority of acreage. If it's the larger operations that are adopting, that have capacity on the team, and that are putting things together, however messily internally, to at least squeeze out additional efficiencies and productivity, that's great. It's on the big data side of things that we hope, right, that there are still maybe some significant gains to be made. And it's clear that with this proliferation of multiple platforms, with farmers either being hesitant or spread too thinly to really invest fully into exploiting those economies, those network externalities, those economies of scale within the platforms, it doesn't sound like they're being fully unlocked yet. Where this goes is going to be, I think, the real game changer moving forward. Now, a few things that I'd like to add on here, and that is that venture capital investment in this sector has been enormous in just about the same time frame as the adoption curves that Terry has shared with us here. In fact, the investments from venture capital have more or less shadowed or mimicked these adoption curves. This is a potential game changer. I don't know if I want to go that far, but it's certainly an aspect of the evolution of this industry that we need to keep our eyes on. So the investments going on in this technology are not just the big corporate players, either the equipment vendors or the input suppliers, but there are also quite a number of smaller ag tech companies, many of them seeding over or crossing over from Silicon Valley type enterprises. These investments and these investors are driven by exit opportunities. They seek a return on that investment. And the big question is whether these startups are acquisition opportunities for the big corporates, and that technology is going to be getting driven into the big corporate portfolios, or whether some of these startups that are VC funded are potentially the future Facebooks, to use your analogy there, of the future. And it really seems like this scramble for becoming one of the potential natural oligopoly, because I doubt if it's really going to shake out to natural monopoly type proportions here, are the ones that are going to, is it going to be the existing corporate players, or is it going to be the new independents that end up dominating the dataverse of agriculture? And in the final minute, I want to point to another potential development that the papers opens up for us to discuss, at least. And that has to do with one opportunity for data-endowed farmland. And that is that it would be very easily enabled to then step into taking advantage of a lot of the market-based and even policy-driven initiatives for environmental services, regenerative agriculture, or carbon farming, as it's being popularized as. These are almost inevitably going to depend upon a certain degree of sampling, but also an awful lot of modeling of how your soils and how your operation as a farm will respond to various practices as to whether or not you are warranted the remuneration under a project contract for whether it's sequestering carbon in your soils, or it's maintaining habitat for biodiversity, or minimizing nutrient runoff and thus assuring water quality. All of these are going to be data-driven, and therefore having the data and the systems in place will enable the adoption of those practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that interesting discussion. Now our first panelist for this session is John Rains. John Rains is the Chief Commercial Officer at the Climate Corporation, the digital farming arm of Bayer Crop Science. John has been involved in production agriculture throughout his life. Growing up in southeast Missouri, he spent his youth working in a family fuel business serving farmers. John, the platform is yours.
Allison, thank you for that, and good afternoon, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this really unique ag symposium that the Federal Reserve has put together. As you mentioned, I lead the Climate Corporation's commercial business. It's certainly an honor to be here with so many industry experts. There's a little bit of background on myself. My family and I are also very actively involved in farming. We run a production farming operation here in the state of Missouri. I also serve as director on a rural bank board, so I get an opportunity to be connected to the lending side of the business, and certainly has spent the last decade focused on the digital transformation that we're seeing. The digitization has become ubiquitous in our lives. If each of you think about the number of times that you've checked something electronically today, you probably would lose count. It has absolutely changed the way in which we all operate. Agriculture is no different to that. And in fact, COVID has increased the use of digital connectivity on the farm immensely over the last 12 to 15 months. The Climate Corporation is solely focused on being a data company. That is at the core who we are. It is about utilizing data to help generate the next breakthrough in agriculture. We think that data will actually transform agriculture once again in the sense of the insights, the information that can be delivered to farmers in their equipment, in the field, wherever they are, to be able to help them better make decisions prospectively. For decades and for literally centuries, we've looked back and we've had a retrospective look on the field of agriculture. What did we do? What didn't we do that caused yield to go up or down? For the first time in the history of agriculture, we actually can be prospective in the field at the time which the crop is being grown. And in fact, our vision at Climate is to help the world's farmers improve yield and productivity through the use of digital tools. That's really at the core of what we're all about. Climate FieldView, that you may be aware of, is our flagship brand that the Climate Corporation owns. FieldView is a hardware and software technology that allows farmers to be able to gather data in the field, whether it's the local retailer around the world that is applying fertilizer, or it's a local retailer that's applying bugs, weeds, or disease materials, or it's the farmer that's doing some of those things, including planting and harvesting. Being able to collect that information, being able to transfer that information into a form that is digitally, it's like a digital map, being able to make it into a picture that the farmer can see, and most importantly, being able to get it to the cloud, really allows us to be able to begin this journey of transforming the use of singular data into an aggregated form, and certainly into an anonymized form for the protection of our farm customers around the world, that allows us to be able to then utilize proprietary algorithms and be able to upgrade that data into data sets or into insights that allow for much greater, opportunities for informed decision making. Being able to combine things like the farmer's data with the product data that a company like Bayer would have, where we would have literally tens of millions of data points depending upon the country and the crop on our seed and our crop protection products. And being able to combine that with the observational data that the farmer is gathering, how they're seeding, how they're planting or spraying or harvesting, the yield data, and then combining that with environmental data, things like the soil type, things like the weather. Those combinations are really at the core of the way we begin to use data science, because it's the interdependencies of each of those that really tells us more about what's driving yield up or down in a given field. And it really is all about how we help the farmers limit their risk. And ultimately, risk mitigation, no different than in capital management, is a big, big part of agriculture from an agronomy-based standpoint. U.S. farmers is where we started with this effort several years ago, but Climate and FieldView have become a global product. We're in well over 20 countries around the world. We have more than 150 million acres connected to FieldView, and it really does get to this point of being able to be simple and easy to use. Terry talked earlier in his opening comments about the benefits of being open sourced, being really easy for the farmer to get to all of their data in one location, to not have to worry about the type of equipment or the crop or the geography in which they're operating in, but to make it really easy. Number two is I mentioned earlier about the fiduciary responsibility of data management, being able to bring data together in an aggregated form that's anonymized where the farmer really understands what is our climate's data policy, being able to understand that when they generate data on their farm with our hardware and software that is absolutely still theirs, we are set up to tell them about how we're going to utilize that to create new value for them and to really be able to focus on upgrading data to a point where there's better insights that are available. So that's a real core part of the way we think about our business. We think about data in three forms. We think about it in its proprietary form in terms of data that is related to our seed and our crop protection products and how we do research on those. We think about it in the sense of the publicly available data, things like soil type that I mentioned earlier or environmental data around the weather. And then the observational data or farmers' data where they're gathering data out of the field across their farm. Those are the areas of data sources that are most commonly referred to or used in our business. And as we really think about how can we utilize this, not just to drive agronomy, to be able to help with better decision making related to things like, yield and productivity, but how do we unlock new opportunities? Things like carbon, as an example. Carbon is an opportunity that exists for all of us, certainly not just in agriculture, but as a public, because it improves the lives in which we lead in the world in which we're operating in and creates much more sustainability for us. But there has to be a measurement of how much carbon is released. There has to be a measurement of how much carbon is captured. FieldView is a great example of a tool that can help in that process. Being able to help farmers, farming is a very risky business. Things like crop insurance, being able to help generate reports that will make it much easier to a farmer to apply and for crop insurance companies to be able to affirm what did or did not happen in the field. Being able to utilize technology as it relates to lending. It's another, very important aspect of the capitalization of a farm. These are things that data connectivity, technologies like FieldView really can improve and really create efficiency for the farmer because it makes it much easier for them. And ultimately, as you think about, we go around the world and certainly we're focused on the U.S. today, agriculture has become a very competitive business from geography to geography. The use of digital technologies will allow the U.S. farmer to continue to be on the cutting edge and stay ahead as it relates to decision making, as it relates to risk mitigation, and even marketing of their commodities and their products. So with that, I just want to say again, thanks to the Federal Reserve and to those that allowed us to be a part of this. We look forward to, I look forward personally to the dialogue and the Q&A, and appreciate the fact that we're utilizing this time to really help focus on digital connectivity and digital technologies in agriculture, because I do believe and we believe that it's an opportunity for us to really improve the way farmers go about the agronomy-based service that they provide to the public and helping us all being able to be more sustainable in how we, if you will, consume our food, manage our natural resources, and convert our natural resources into food, fuel, feed, and fiber. And with that, Allison, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, John, for your remarks. Our next panelist is Deanna Kovar. Deanna Kovar serves as Vice President of Production and Precision Ag Production Systems with John Deere's Agricultural and Turf Division. In this role, she leads a global team of experts focused on unlocking value for the agriculture industry through equipment and technology solutions. Deanna, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Allison, and good afternoon to all. It's fantastic to be with you all today and alongside this amazing panel. First off, let me say thank you to Terry, Lavana, and Elizabeth for this well-thought-out database paper on how farmers in the U.S. have adopted technology and engaged data on their farms. Also, the session on productivity right before this was fascinating and very interconnected to the role of technology and data. At John Deere, I've spent much of the last 2 decades focused on how we can help farmers here in the U.S., but also globally, recognize the value that precision ag technologies can have on their individual farms. What is unique about agriculture compared to other industries is that the economic goals on the farm are generally aligned to the environmental goals, as both are focused on growing more with less. And that's the ultimate definition of productivity and of precision agriculture. In today's regulatory and social environments, we have an amazing opportunity to leverage this alignment of financial and social incentives that will accelerate adoption of precision ag technologies further. As I reflect on my lifetime in agriculture, and specifically my 20 plus years in the ag equipment and technology business, we have seen immense change and technology acceleration. We've moved from managing at the farm level to the field level and to the subfield level. The acceleration began in the late 90s as yield monitoring and yield mapping I lost my spot. I apologize. We've moved from managing at the farm level to the field level and to the subfield level. The acceleration began in the late 90s as yield monitoring and yield mapping were just getting started. That led us to the decade of the 2000s, in which GPS became prevalent, highlighted by yellow domes on the top of most vehicles planting, spraying, and harvesting in America's heartlands. Those vehicles today leverage robotics to create repeatable sub-inch positioning accuracy. The 2010s saw the onset of cloud-based data enablement that took all those years of binders, data cards, and USB sticks and assembled them in the cloud so the data could be visualized, shared, and leveraged to a whole new level. And now, as we embrace the 2020s, we will move from managing at the subfield level to managing at the individual plant level, as technologies like computer vision and machine learning are already being utilized to do things like discerning a weed from a plant, augmenting the farmer's eyes to see places they can't see, and making decisions and acting in real time at the plant level. Terry's paper summarized different views of adoption at the farm and farmer level. I would like to share some perspectives about technology from my seat in the industry. First, let's talk about who is adopting technology. As the paper stated, there is a propensity for larger farms and younger farms to make up the earlier parts of the adoption curve. However, our data shows that there are farms of all sizes and farmers of all ages in every category of adoption, from innovator to laggard. To accelerate this decades-long adoption curve to something shorter, we must continue to think about farms of all ages and sizes as we develop and market these new technologies. At Deere, this means we will invest in the development of easy-to-use technology to help all sizes of farms and all ages of farmers, no matter how tech-savvy they are. Beyond age and scale, another way I believe we should measure success is to focus on what percent of acres are leveraging the technology. Acres, not farms and farmers. It is similar to how we at Deere have approached the conversation about rural broadband initiatives. We all know that connectivity on the farm and in rural areas is paramount to keeping our rural communities thriving. If telecoms and governments only look at the people available to connect, we will miss an amazing opportunity to connect the acres and machines rolling across those acres, growing the world's food and fiber. Success in precision ag adoption should be thought of the same way relative to acres versus people to truly understand the impact it is having. Additionally, we have found in our precision ag adoption research that one of the most important things that impacts adoption is certainty. We all know that farming is uncertain and variable. The weather, the markets, even the soil. As we have studied adoption of technologies, we can quickly see that the more certain we can make the value of the technology, the quicker the industry will adopt it. Take AutoTrack, our self-driving technology. This is a technology that a farmer can see work through straight rows and reduced overlap. For AutoTrack, it is easy to do the math. And on top of being good economically, and environmentally, it also makes the farmer's life better. This certainty of value has driven stronger adoption across more acres quicker than other technologies like variable rate application. The uncertainty of knowing the true cause and effect benefits of variable rate have created slower adoption across the acres. To drive adoption, we need to drive certainty of value. There is also a great opportunity to ensure as an industry we have the foundational infrastructure for precision technologies to be successful. I've talked about basic needs like rural broadband at the community level, but there's also infrastructure at the fleet level. At Deere, we've thought about this at critical points over the past 20 years. One example was our mid-2000s decision to put the steering controls required to auto track in base equipment, eliminating costly installation times. Another example was our 2011 decision to make connectivity pervasive in our equipment, even when we weren't exactly sure what all the benefits would be. Today, farmers have the opportunity to leverage the connectivity for maintenance, proactive repairs, easy flow of agronomic data, and more, all managed from the smartphone in their pocket. Tons of value only created because the infrastructure is there. And there are opportunities for farmer value that are just ideas today. These ideas will evolve over the coming years, and they would not have been possible without this commitment to technology infrastructure. That brings me to my final point. With all this technology that is automating farmers' work and pervasive flow of information, we must care for the data that we are being entrusted with. At Deere, we know that our 184 years of history and trust cannot and will not be compromised. So we are extremely transparent about how we manage data about the equipment and agronomy, and that the farmer is 100% in control of how their data will be used to support them and support agriculture. One of the most important points that Terry's paper made about the future was that for data to be valuable for individuals, something Gregory called small data, we must have broad engagement from many. Engagement and sharing data into an integrated, interconnected big data platform will only happen if there is clear understanding and transparency about how industry players are planning to leverage the data. At Deere, our approach is spelled out at deere.com/trust in simple, straightforward words, and is our directive for how we think about being stewards of agriculture's data. It is why the American Farm Bureau bestowed the Ag Data Transparency Certification on Deere's data policy in 2018. I am confident that data will be the fuel to the next decades of productivity, growing more with less. Because we know for each farm to truly harness the power of data on their individual farms, the industry needs to embrace and engage in data-enabled agriculture. In summary, we are in an amazing place in agriculture where economic and environmental goals are aligned. And we have a toolkit today to create changes in our ability to grow more with less. Adoption of precision ag technology should be measured at the acre level to truly understand the impact these technologies are having on our industry. The certainty of the outcome, if I can see it, I can believe it, will drive adoption more than anything else. We must think about the industry's infrastructure and each farm's infrastructure to drive even more adoption. And finally, if we want the next wave of technology to be fruitful, we must care for the farmer's data in a way that allows everyone to benefit. So with that, I want to thank you for this opportunity to share my perspective. Thanks to Nate for asking me to be a part of this great panel, and I look forward to some great dialogue.
Great. Thank you, Deanna, and thanks to all of our presenters for sharing your perspectives. What a great way to kick off this session. Now let's turn to questions for our four presenters, and I'd like to invite all of our speakers to turn on their cameras. As a reminder, please keep submitting any questions using the link on your screen. We will get to as many questions as possible in the time remaining for the session. So we're already getting a bunch of really good questions coming in, and I'm going to start with this first question, which really goes out to any of our speakers. Where do farm operators primarily get their information about emerging and existing technology, and how does that impact the rate and willingness to adopt? I'll just open the floor up.
Yeah, I'll start, Allison, if that's okay.
Great.
I think what we have found is that it differs from the early adopters and innovators to the early majority of the adoption curve. And certainly those on the front end of the adoption curve are probably more connected and scouring different places to find those next technologies. Where those farms that maybe fall into the early majority or the laggard part of the adoption curve are waiting to see it operate in their local area or hear it from another farmer. And so it's definitely different. But as you go down that adoption curve, seeing my neighbor do it and be successful is a big part of somebody else adopting it on their farm.
Absolutely.
And maybe, Allison, to build on, are you wanting more than one comment, or are you wanting someone to go
Please
first
go ahead.
with the question? Well, I'd just add that I think the two most primary places around the world are, one is their peer group. It's their neighbors. It's those that are in the industry with them. And number two is, I think it speaks to what's happened with just what we're doing today and the use of technology is we just see so many of our customers going to the internet, going to social media, and going to technological forums to gather information because what used to be more of going to an extension meeting or going to an industry meeting has moved to a much more electronically connected world, and I think that's what we're seeing change.
Yes, certainly, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, the local John Deere dealer for us is a huge part of sharing those technologies with growers. And, every farm is unique, every fleet is different. And so for us, the John Deere dealer is that last mile to help a farmer think about what might be the next technology that they can adopt on their farm.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing. Let's turn to another question. During the previous session, there was discussion about the role of R&D spending in agricultural productivity. What role do you think public R&D funding and other types of public investment could have in ensuring equitable adoption of new technologies across different demographic groups, particularly socially disadvantaged groups and young and beginning farmers?
One of the questions that I think about is, should all farmers adopt all technologies? And I think the answer there is clearly no. There are some technologies that would have a higher adoption rate, than others. But just because it hasn't enjoyed 100% adoption does not necessarily mean that the technology was a failure. It's not just livestock versus crop farms, but even within crop farms, there are lots of different the where, the who, the why, and the when.
I think
it depends on where you are around the world as well. If you think about R&D spend today, I think there's two parts to it. One is, I think you're going to see a whole lot more public and private sectors partnering to help drive the use of technology around the world. Number two is, I think you're seeing today currently a lot more focus around rural broadband and really just trying to provide access. And then the third is, I think it depends on how you define technology. When we talk a lot, and even in this forum, we think about technology in a piece of equipment, and that's certainly a big part of it. But when you look at world areas like Asia as an example, and you think about, places like India and China, where you've got more than 1 billion farmers in just each of those two countries themselves, technology is as simple as a cell phone. And being able to access information, being able to make better decisions real time, those are areas that are really going to drive agronomy and going to drive productivity around the world as we go through the next couple of decades here.
And if you think about the foundational technology, all started from GPS, which we wouldn't have had GPS at the point in time we did if it weren't for public funding. So public funding of infrastructure and the foundation, and then private companies coming in and either adding accuracy or driving it more into more applications, I think should be the norm, and we should expect to see more and more of it.
Great. So this next question kind of builds on that and talking about some of the drivers of technological change. The question is, as we move forward in the Biden administration and the push for climate smart farming, do you expect that to drive some data tech advancements to help farmers of all sizes participate in those public programs that emerge?
You know, as I stated in my remarks, the beauty of agriculture and why I'm so proud to be a part of it is the fact that the environmental goals and the economic goals on the farm are so well connected relative to growing more with less. It's a simple equation. And so I expect that as more and more opportunities come to prove that equation of there's an environmental benefit and an economic benefit, that yes, we will see more technology adoption on the farm. We will see more data engagement because there's now a multiple layer benefit that's certain, just like I talked about. As you can drive more certainty to value, adoption happens. And so I think all of those things stacking up will definitely lead to more data-enabled agriculture and more technology on the farm.
I think the risk preference of the farm operator will also come into play. I had a graduate student a few years ago who evaluated farmers' perceptions of risk with respect to farm data around, they were producing around environmentally sensitive areas. And a certain group of farmers took the information that they had and said, you know what, I'm going to collect a lot of good information so that I can prove that I did not over apply and I followed the rules. And then I had another set of farmers who said, you know what, I'm going to collect no data so that it cannot be used against me. So it's going to come back to the economic incentives and penalties and rewards and the risk preference. You know, a lot of farmers are not necessarily risk neutral. We have a lot of risk averse behavior.
I think an important way to think about this issue is that it's going to add one more source of value to that data and to the measurements of the characteristics of the operation, which will help to drive further adoption. It'll also create further incentives for additional innovation going forward in the future, new ways to visualize, new ways to gather data, new ways to analyze it.
Great, thanks. Let's turn to another question. So this question is geared towards Mr. Rains or Professor Graff. How do issues of data ownership use play out on a specific parcel of ground that encounters a change of ownership or operator change? Is it left with the given operator?
I've written about this, but I'll see what Greg and John have to say.
I'll be glad to share our perspective. I think there's more than one part to that question. One is the farmer themselves. So the farmer that generates the data with their equipment, regardless of the hardware or the software they're using to generate that data, our position has and continues to be that the farmer owns that data. They are the owner. Whatever agreement that they've made with the landlord, in this particular case where there's going to be a tenant change, is between the farmer and the landlord. If they choose to do business with us, we have a fiduciary responsibility about how we would utilize that data and certainly keep it proprietary to them and make sure that it's aggregated and anonymized if we use it. So I think it depends again on what the farmer has that was originally generating that data and the agreements and the relationships that they've set up in accordance to it.
So assuming that farmland is the most inelastic factor of production, it would seem logical that the farm data would be tied to the farmland rather than whoever happens to be the owner or the tenant at the given time. And that being said, it comes back to a bidding process. And if there is value to the farm data, it's most likely to be tied to the land itself.
Thank you so much for that. Let's turn to another question. So just as we have seen previous technological change or the ability of equipment to accurately function in reduced tillage applications, in addition to increased size of equipment has led to consolidation of farms. Will the increased adoption of technology and data usage lead to further rounds of consolidation, or in other words, more larger farms and fewer farmers?
I think
I'll take a shot at it. Pardon me, Terry, please.
I just want to give an example of, we've stated that technology favors large acres to spread out the fixed cost, but you can come up with examples of, small acreage farmers coming together to form a data cooperative, essentially leveling the playing field. Such, a farmer with 50,000 acres gets better insights into farm data than a farmer with only 1,000 acres. But if you get a dozen 1,000 acre farmers together, then they can potentially get insights that they normally wouldn't have.
Yeah, I would just simply add that, again, I think it depends on where you're at in the world. It depends on the type of farm operation, et cetera, because one of the things that is occurring today is more information because of the use of technology and the use of a phone. Something as simple as a tablet is allowing smallholder farmers around the world to have access to information for the first time that they've ever had it. To Terry's point, depending upon whether you're on the Cerrados of Brazil, and you're dealing with farmers that are farming tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of acres, compared to a Midwest or Mid-South farmer here in the U.S. that's farming several thousand. The way in which those farmers access that technology and the way they use it, I think, can have a real impact in a beneficial way. And that's the cool part is we just need to be able to provide them access to the technology. We need to be able to provide the ability to have rural broadband or the use of cellular, and be able to help those farmers around the world be able to get access to the information and make it, to Terry's point earlier, make it open source, because human capital is becoming a bigger problem, and data is going to help manage that as time goes on.
And I believe there's probably automation technologies and other things that will actually allow small or mid-sized farmers to stay on the farm even longer as well. So technology not only has a scaling effect on the larger side, but I believe it can help smaller farmers over time as well.
Thank you. This next question is for Terry specifically and relates to some of the PowerPoint slides that you showed. Do you know how the distribution of generations and farming data that you utilized in your paper compared to all of the Midwest and other regions of the U.S.? Specifically on your slide number 6, looking at the portion of farm operations by generation category.
No, I do not. I do have a project with USDA ERS, Economic Research Service, where we're looking into some of the more specifics, and this will be at the national level. But fortunately for me, unfortunately for everybody else, Kansas State University has access to a really great 2,000 farmer database, KFMA, that Illinois has something comparable, but otherwise, there's nothing like this available anywhere else on the planet.
Thanks, Terry. Here's another question. According to USDA ERS data, approximately 90% of farms earn less than $350,000 in gross cash farm income annually. Though farms with GCFI higher than $350,000 constitute only about 10% of the total, their share of production is approximately 75%. So to what extent has adoption affected production and income across different sizes of farms? Maybe both looking at a U.S. level, but then also thinking about how kind of more of a global perspective on income as well. Anyone want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I see that as a follow-up of the previous question in some regards. And to summarize a little bit of what we heard there, we've seen a bit of a hollowing out in ag census data here in the U.S., but I think it's true elsewhere in the world, where we've got much of the acreage, as the question states, stacked into a few very large farms, but we also see an increase in small farms doing high-value applications or lifestyle farming. And small farmers use internet connectivity and various apps to help drive their businesses just as much as the big farms do. Moreover, we do see a lot of innovators in emerging and developing economies, specifically in the IT and internet space, and they are creating applications specific to their needs, to their markets, and rolling them out for their neighbors and colleagues.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that a lot of these technologies that we're talking about aren't requiring a brand new fleet of equipment either. They're retrofittable onto older, smaller units that are used of farmers of all sizes. And that's a great opportunity for, in the US, for a farm of any size to think about what's that next technology. If I'm already using AutoTrack, can I take section control? Is it right for me to connect my equipment? And all of those things can be done no matter if you've got a 30-year-old or 20-year-old fleet or a brand new all green fleet as well. And then as we think globally, there are parts of the world like Western Europe where regulation is driving us to see a lot more adoption of tools like variable rate and monitoring all of the inputs very precisely. And so while we don't see huge mega farms in Western Europe, there's still a ton of technology adoption there driven a lot by regulations as well. So, that's the beauty of ag tech is you don't have to have the latest and greatest to make it work on your farm.
Thank you both for weighing in on that one. Here's another question for the group. What role can agriculture leaders, so thinking of commercial banks, farm credit systems, or others, have in increasing the propensity of ag producers to invest and adopt in new technologies? Does the current risk tolerance of primary lending institutions allow for timely adoptions of technology and data use?
For my part, go ahead, Terry, please.
I was just going to state that some of my research, when I've asked the question, is precision ag profitable? It turns out that farmers who make money buy new equipment, and therefore they get technology along with it.
We'd like to think there's a cause and effect there, more than a correlation maybe, Terry. But I think overall the ag lending community is typically very excited to see farmers adopt technologies, whether it's things that can help them control the amount of inputs and lower their costs. A product like AutoTrack is a 10% reduction in inputs. So as I talked about earlier, that certainty is really there. And then once you have those technologies, the ability to layer on more and more on top is a great opportunity. And then from a data standpoint, like John and I both talked about data, from an ag lender standpoint, I think there's also a real excitement about the opportunity for our farmers to make their farms even better by measuring more and making those decisions about the next best decision on their farm. So for me, I'm biased. We have a captive lender at John Deere who's very supportive of technology on farms, but beyond that as well, I don't see that as a barrier at all.
Great. So we're running close to the end of our session, just a couple of minutes left. So let me throw out one final question to all of our speakers. What do you see as the greatest risk to actual technology and data implementation on the individual operator level over the next 5 years?
Let me be the devil's advocate. If a farm data platform truly exists where it has a lot of farm data from across the country, the thing that keeps me up at night is a nefarious not taking of the data, but planting bad data that may prove that farmers did something that they're not supposed to be doing. That bothers me. I think that's one of the greatest threats when it comes to farm data.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
I believe it's just the lack of interoperability across platforms and tools, quite frankly.
Yeah, I personally think, and I mentioned, or Deanna mentioned AutoTrack, and by the way, it is excellent technology. Being able to shut off rows, being able to be much more precise in the field is better for the farmer from a management standpoint. It's better for cost. It's better for sustainability. But I also agree with Greg that ultimately being able to get to where there is interoperability between all of the equipment, where there is easy and open source access to data, no matter whether it's at the retail level, whether it's in the equipment, whether, just getting it to the cloud in a manner to where the farmer can utilize, whether it's their own first level insights or it's companies like ours or companies that, they're in the space like ours that can help them turn that data into more information that's more actionable, I think is really where we are able over the next several decades to drive value on the farm as well as sustainability.
Well, great. Go ahead. Sorry, Deanna.
Yeah, I would just add, to me, part of the risk of technology adoption is not having the information to know whether it was a good decision or not a good decision. And really thinking about how can I, on my individual farm, do A/B-wise testing and understand what's the right thing for me to do. And to do that, you've got to collect the data, you've got to compare it, and you've got to understand it. So to me, the risk is not engaging and not collecting the data to really understand what's that next best thing for me to do on my dirt and my farm.
Well, great. I think it's time for us to wrap up session 2, but I want to thank Terry, Gregory, John, and Deanna for sharing your thoughts with us this afternoon. And I also want to thank all of the audience members for such great questions that generated a really healthy discussion during this Q&A time period.